Alright, so let's talk about the difference between saturation and vibrance. So as we discussed in the last video, saturation is all about the amount of color in the image, right? So if the saturation of reds is high, then your reds in the image are pretty intense. There's a lot of red in the image. Vibrance is very similar to saturation. The difference between vibrance is that it talks about relative color instead of just the absolute colors. So in Photoshop or Lightroom, there is a saturation slider, and when you increase the saturation slider, what it does is it equally increases the color of all the regions in the image. So the blue regions, the red regions, the green regions, everything equally increases in saturation. But the vibrance, on the other hand, if you increase the vibrance in Photoshop or Lightroom, there's a slider for that as well. If you increase vibrance, then what it does is that it adds more saturation to the areas that are lesser in terms of saturation. So it relatively increases the saturations of the regions that don't really, pop out, and it keeps the regions that are already saturated the same. It doesn't do anything to those regions. So saturation also, like the saturation slider in Lightroom and Photoshop, also has a kind of a subtle effect. So if you pump up the saturation completely, it won't look really gross. Whereas if you pump up the vibrance, even though it's increasing the relative saturation of the colors, it is going to do it in a much more non-subtle way, in a much more explicit way, so that you can really notice that things have changed. Whereas the saturation slider is much more subtle. So those are the two main differences. Also, the vibrance slider, in addition to being more intense, it also preserves the skin colors. So skin is generally kind of saturated already. It has red and orange tones. So when you increase the vibrance, it keeps those skin colors, the skin tones, kind of preserved, and it doesn't really oversaturate it. Whereas saturation, since it's just increasing the saturation of everything, it oversaturates the skin. And the thing about skin tones is that when you look at an image, if skin tones are off, you immediately notice that something is wrong with the image. Whereas the other colors, like the objects around you, those can be a little bit less or more saturated and you still won't notice it. But skin tones, humans immediately notice if skin tones are off. So alright, so the three main differences are saturation, first of all, is talks about the entire image, all the colors in the image, and it equally increases or decreases the saturation of the image when you move the sliders. Whereas vibrance, it talks about the relative color and not the absolute color. And when you move the vibrance slider in Lightroom or Photoshop, it only changes the relative color and keeps the oversaturated regions as such, and it doesn't change the saturation of those regions. And the second difference is that saturation is a more subtle effect. If you move the sliders, it's going to change the colors a little more subtly, but the vibrance slider does it more explicitly, and you can really see the intense changes that it's making. The third difference is that the saturation slider doesn't really care about the skin tones, since it just increases the saturation of all regions, whereas the vibrance slider, since it is relatively increasing the saturation of different regions, takes into account the skin tones and keeps the skin tones in the skin tone range. Okay, so let's look at an example here in Lightroom. So I have this image of Tahoe that I clicked last year. By the way, all these images are taken by me. So there is this region here in Lightroom that says vibrance and saturation. So there are two sliders here. The ones that we talked about last time, the HSL sliders, those were color specific. There is a vibrance and a saturation slider here that is not specific to any color, but just changes the saturation vibrance of the whole image. So we're going to be looking at these two sliders. So in this case, just take a look. If I increase the saturation, see what's happening? The saturation of the whole image increased. Whereas, let me reset the saturation and increase the vibrance. And look at this. The vibrance increased, but you can see that it affected the regions that were not saturated before, and it kept the saturated regions the same. Now, to show you more about how this is working, let me zoom into this region here. So look at this region. When I increase the saturation slider, see what happened there? All these regions here, they started getting more and more yellowish, right? See this region, it got so yellowish. Whereas if I increase the vibrance, let me reset the saturation and increase the vibrance here. So take a look when I increase the vibrance. It didn't get yellowish because that region was already kind of saturated. And increasing the saturation here makes it yellowish, but increasing the vibrance does not. That's what I mean by keeping the already saturated regions the same and increasing the saturation of the less saturated regions, right? Now, let's take a look at another example here. This is a pretty cool example. So as you can see here, we have a cube which has the red face facing the camera, and as you can see, the red part is pretty saturated already. But if I increase the saturation, you can see that it's getting really oversaturated and it's really popping out. But if I reset the saturation and increase the vibrance, you can see that not really much is happening because vibrance knows that it's already saturated, so it's not doing anything. Let me set this back, change the saturation slider again, see that? Whereas the vibrance, not really doing anything. Let's take a look at the final image here. So as you can see here, this one has skin tones. So the reason I selected this is to look at the skin tones here. So if you take the saturation slider and increase it, you see that it's really popping out the skin tones and it doesn't look good. Let's do the same thing with the vibrance slider. You see that? The vibrance slider really didn't do much to the skin tones. The skin still looks like skin. Whereas the saturation slider kind of ruined the skin tones. If you show anyone this image, they're going to say something is wrong with the skin tone here. So that's how vibrance and saturation really come into picture. The other thing that you probably want to look at is when I increase the saturation here, you can see that it's kind of a subtle effect. But if I increase the vibrance, you can see that the regions, the skin tones are kind of the same, but you can see that the regions like the shirt, let's zoom into the shirt here for a moment. Yeah, look at the shirt. The shirt its color kind of increased very intensely, very explicitly. Whereas if I increase the saturation, you can see it's almost the same, because saturation is not a very explicit effect. It just increases the shirt was kind of unsaturated before, so it increased the saturation of all regions equally. The skin was already saturated, but it increased that also, and the shirt was non-saturated and increased that also. It increased everything equally. So that's why it's a kind of a subtle effect in regions that are not saturated. But vibrance, on the other hand, it's more intense because it's trying to bring the saturation of the shirt to the same as the most saturated parts, like the face. So it doesn't change the face a whole lot, but it changes the shirt by a lot because it's trying to match the saturation here. That's why vibrance seems like a very explicit effect if you don't have a lot of saturation in most of your image. Now, as you can see from these images, a whole lot of things can be done by just using these two sliders, and it's a very powerful tool to modify and play around with the colors in your image.